Some background about what was going on in the world at the time was the United States entered World War I and passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act criminalized obstructing military recruitment or for causing or conspiring disloyalty and insubordination in the armed forces. The Sedition Act criminalized any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the United States government or military or any speech intended to incite insubordination or refusal of duty. The goals of both of these acts were prohibiting interference with military operations or recruitment during the wartime. Some background about Charles Schenck was that he was a Philadelphia socialist. He opposed the United States entering the war, and he organized the distribution of 15,000 leaflets to military draftees, encouraging them to resist the draft. His leaflet quoted a section of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude. So some background to the case is that Schenck was arrested for conspiring to violate the Espionage Act. Him and Elizabeth Bear were both convicted following a jury trial and sentenced to 6 months in prison. They both appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court. They argue their convictions in Section 3 of the Espionage Act of 1917, under which they were convicted, violated their First Amendment. They claim that the act had the effect of dissuading the outlawing of protected speech about the war effort, and it basically abridged the First Amendment's protection of the freedom of speech. Some of the constitutional questions is that does the Espionage and Sedition Acts go against the First Amendment with the freedom of speech? Are the Espionage and Sedition Acts constitutional with the events happening at the time? And did Schenck and Bear have the right to speak out about drafting for the war? So 2 different ways that the court's decision could go was that they could go for the court's decision originally. For the events at the time, those acts were needed to keep chaos at a minimum, so there were enough soldiers in the war. That the leaflets caused danger in the military, and it is the First World War, and the United States does not want to be on the losing side because it did involve a lot of damage in many different countries. The other way this court case could go was to go towards Schenck and Bear, that the Espionage and Sedition Acts did not allow for free speech about the government or the war effort, and that they were strictly sharing their political views about the drafting of the military. The actual outcome of the case was that the court held that the Espionage Act did not violate the First Amendment, and it was an appropriate exercise of the Congress's wartime authority. The leaflets caused clear and present danger, and the First Amendment does not protect these leaflets because of the clear and present danger that they caused, and that it was a significant evil that the Congress did have the power to prevent. The spread of the leaflets was likely to disrupt the conscription process for the military, and it was concluded that the courts owed greater deference to the government during wartime, even when the constitutional rights were at stake because of the events at hand.
So the reasoning behind the court's unanimous decision against Schenck was because that they believed that the Espionage Act did not violate the First Amendment. They stated that because what Schenck was trying to do with Elizabeth Bear was considered clear and present danger, it was not in violation of their First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Schenck spoke out against the conscription process during a war, and his goal was to convince people not to enlist into the draft. So because of this, it was considered a clear and present danger, and the Supreme Court Justice Oliver W. Holmes stated that the First Amendment did not protect that kind of speech, and it can bring harm to a piece of legislation written. A metaphor used for this was like shouting fire in a crowded room when there is no fire. The reason this case was so significant is because the Supreme Court decided to prioritize the federal government's power over Schenck's right to freedom of speech. Even though Schenck believed that the First Amendment protected him in whatever he was saying, the Supreme Court decided that he was in violation of the Espionage Act and deserved punishment for doing so. From this point on, it would be recognized to the government and to the people that the government had a right to restrict freedom of speech if there was a clear and present danger. It showed the people of the United States that speech is not entirely free and that there are certain circumstances that it can be limited. The two cases I found both followed the same precedent as Schenck versus the United States, and they happened around the same time. Browerk was convicted for violating the Espionage Act, as well as Schenck was, and he wrote a newspaper article criticizing the U.S. involvement in World War I. The court ruled that he was violating the Espionage Act because he was believed to cause disloyalty to the citizens to the country during the war. Debs versus the United States was similar to Schenck's case because Deb was convicted for delivering a speech that incited the listeners to interfere with the recruitment process for the military. So, again, the court decided that this was in violation of the Espionage Act because it was Deb speaking out against the recruitment process, and there was another unanimous decision in the Supreme Court in favor of the U.S. based off of the ruling Schenck v. U.S. So lastly, the little trick I found to remembering this case is a meme I found online of Dr. Evil from the movies Austin Powers making fun of the ruling that the court made against Schenck v. U.S., saying that dodging the draft wouldn't necessarily cause a clear and present danger, but according to the ruling, it was enough to vote Schenck guilty.